I see all these TikToks on, I see all these reels on TikToks made by millennials bashing boomers, right? And millennials talking about their suffering like they're the first generation who has ever suffered in this entire world. They're the first generation to have feelings. They're the first generation to experience abuse or neglect. They're the first generation to feel like they had shitty parents, or, this girl gets on, she's a millennial, sitting in her car, whining that her parents never taught her that she was worth loving, that she was lovable, and that she was worth anything. And then another one chimes in and does a duet with that one. And so many of these millennials talk like they invented feelings. They're the first people. They're the first generation that's ever hurt. I guess the truth of it, when you break it right down, I think maybe it's because the generations prior didn't bitch enough and they haven't heard our stories yet. And, when my mother was this girl's age, my mother wasn't sitting in a car that she owned. She had a few children. She was being abused by her alcoholic husband. She wasn't sitting in a car that she owned. She had almost no rights. There was no birth control. She was having children that she didn't want. Imagine continuing to have pregnancies and bring children into the world, and you have no choice. And, my mom at times was, she told me about this time she's standing on the edge of the bridge holding the hands of her children and she's ready to jump. She's a woman with no rights, no property. She's being abused. She's got no money. She's got no, and she's got these children. She's married. Each generation does a bit better than the next, right? And then me, I raised my child. I did better than my mom. Was I resentful? My mom left home with nothing. She wasn't given any money. She had no education. I left home with nothing. I wasn't given any money. No education, no college degree. Fortunately, my husband and I were able to pay for my child's college degree. So she's got that head start in life. She won't be living in poverty. She isn't living in poverty. But, she was a millennial. She thought she was the first generation to hurt, to have feelings, to feel lonely, But this generation is the first generation that I've seen that unique, that wants so bad to be extremely unique and wants to be the only generation that has ever suffered before in history. And newsflash, you're not. Every generation before you has suffered. Every generation before you has suffered and felt, and they're the only ones who think that they've gone through abuse and neglect or hard done by their parents. Every generation before you has suffered. Every generation before you has suffered. You're not unique. You didn't invent feelings. And then when these women are going to be juggling children and jobs and their husbands, they're going to be the first ones experiencing that hardship. And then when they go through menopause, they're going to be the first generation to experience menopause. Honestly. Also, they're the first generation who never asked to be born. Because I asked to be born into an alcoholic, dysfunctional, generational trauma in a family with no money and the sixth child. Because I asked to be brought into that level of neglect But the difference with us, we bitched and complained, but we didn't sit around and blame a whole entire generation for our suffering. And we had no delusions that we were the first generation to suffer. I actually had, I experienced a lot of neglect and abuse. I always had empathy for my mom. Even though she was, the cause of a lot of suffering, I understood her suffering. But millennials seem beyond that. And, every generation thinks they're going to break all the generational curses. They're going to change it all. Their kids are going to have a perfect life. Well, that's what I thought too. And newsflash, you're not the only generation who thought that. Every generation that came before you thought that our children were going to have it way better and our children were going to have nothing to complain about. And I was going to fix the world. But guess what? I broke a lot of generational stuff, but I couldn't do it all. One thing I couldn't give my family, my kid, was a healthy extended family. Because everyone's not well. People aren't, Anyways, dear millennials, you're not the first generation to suffer. You didn't invent feelings. You didn't invent trauma and neglect. You're not the first generation that didn't ask to be born. And you're not going to, you're not going to be perfect parents. I'm sorry to break that to you. You're not going to every generation does better for their children, but you're not going to be a perfect parent, and you're not going to have perfect children. I'm sorry to break that to you.